My name is Emily Carson. I'm 30 years old, and I never thought the day would come when the two people who abandoned me 15 years ago would suddenly show up at my doorstep smiling as if nothing ever happened. 15 years ago, when I was just 15, my parents, Robert and Linda Carson, decided that I was a burden they no longer wanted. They left me alone in that crumbling little apartment while they moved across the country, chasing a life of comfort and indulgence, leaving me with nothing but bitter memories and a gnawing sense of worthlessness. I remember sitting on the cold linoleum floor, my hands shaking as I dialed the only number I knew I could trust my aunt's. She took me in, fed me, gave me clothes, and for the first time I felt what it meant to belong somewhere. I grew up with my aunt's love and the harsh lessons of survival learning to fend for myself while my so-called parents built a life that they never shared with me. I went through high school dodging ridicule and abuse from kids whose parents had money and stability, things I could never count on. I worked multiple jobs, scraped together enough to pay for college, and eventually found a career in a small law firm that taught me the intricacies of justice and standing up for what's right. Life was hard, but I never forgot the betrayal, and I never forgot the anger that simmered inside me every time I thought about them. Then last year, a terrible accident changed everything. I was hit by a car while walking home late from work, and after months of surgeries, rehabilitation, and a grueling fight with insurance companies, I received a settlement that changed my life. It was more money than I had ever seen enough to pay off debts, buy a home, and secure my future in a way I never dreamed of as a teenager. I felt a mixture of relief and vindication, knowing that despite everything I had clawed my way out of the pit they left me in. But that victory, sweet as it was, brought with it something I hadn't anticipated. One rainy afternoon, while I was unpacking boxes in my new apartment, there was a knock at the door. I opened it expecting a delivery, but instead I was face to face with the two people who had made my life a living hell, smiling nervously as if their sudden appearance could erase the years of neglect. "Emily," my mother said, her voice soft and hesitant, "we heard about your accident settlement. We just, we want to see you." My father stood behind her, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning me as if measuring what I had become. I froze, my mind racing. My chest tightened as memories flooded back the nights I cried alone. The hunger, the fear, the empty apartment that smelled of despair. "You're here now," my father added, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "We just want to talk about the future, about the inheritance." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Inheritance. After everything, I wanted to scream, to slap them, to demand an explanation for the years of abandonment, but instead I felt a cold calm wash over me. I realized that this was the moment I had been preparing for my entire adult life, the moment where my strength, intelligence, and patience could turn the tables on the very people who had tried to break me. I invited them in silently, noting the way they hesitated before stepping across the threshold, the way they tried to act casual while I led them into the living room. I made sure the atmosphere was controlled, deliberate, my posture confident, my voice steady. I didn't need to shout. The power was in the calm, in the authority I carried from years of fighting for my own survival. "Let's sit," I said, gesturing to the couch, and they obeyed uneasily, like children caught in a game they didn't understand. And then I began to speak carefully, methodically, recounting events from their past negligence, their selfish choices, and the consequences of abandoning me. I could see the color drain from their faces, the forced smiles faltering, the discomfort growing with every word. They tried to interject, tried to justify, but I held firm, guiding the conversation with precision, revealing truths that had been buried for 15 long years. I watched as the veneer of civility cracked, as they realized that the little girl they had abandoned had grown into a woman who not only survived, but thrived despite them. My aunt's lessons, my hard work, my resilience, they all converged in this one moment, allowing me to reclaim the dignity and power that had been stolen from me. And then I made it clear any attempt to claim a part of my settlement, my future, would have consequences. Legal consequences. Public consequences. I wasn't just protecting money. I was protecting the life I had built from the ashes of their betrayal. I could see panic flicker in their eyes, the smirk my father had worn now replaced with a pale, desperate expression. My mother's calm facade had melted, revealing the fear and guilt she had tried to mask for decades. I realized then, with a bittersweet satisfaction, that the real victory wasn't just financial. It was the realization that I had outsmarted the very people who once thought they could control me, and that I could expose them to the world for what they truly were. And even as they stumbled over excuses and half hearted apologies, I knew one undeniable truth: family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by those who stay, who sacrifice, and who truly care. My parents may have returned, but it was too late. The people who had nurtured me, who had stood by me, were my real family, and nothing they said or did could ever change that. This was the moment where the past met the present, where betrayal collided with triumph, and where a little girl's pain transformed into a woman's justice, deliberate, unyielding, and absolute. Growing up without my parents was like walking through a world that wasn't built for me, every corner filled with reminders that I was unwanted, unloved, and invisible. I remember the first day they left me. I was 15, clutching a tattered backpack with only a few clothes and my notebooks staring at the door that closed behind them as if it had swallowed my childhood whole. The apartment felt emptier than ever, the silence deafening, and I sank to the floor, hugging my knees, unable to understand why the people who were supposed to love me had abandoned me. My neighbors whispered about the poor girl whose parents didn't care, and though I tried to keep my head high, shame and anger mingled in a bitter cocktail that I would carry for years. Luckily, my Aunt Marlene stepped in, a single woman who had no children of her own, but somehow had a heart big enough for mine. She took me in without hesitation, gave me meals that filled more than just my stomach, and taught me lessons that no school could ever offer. She taught me resilience, patience, and the quiet power of self-reliance. I learned to value education not just as a path to a career, but as a shield against the world that had already shown me how cruel it could be. I worked after-school jobs, cleaning houses, tutoring younger children, waiting tables, anything that kept me busy and helped me feel like I was building something, anything for myself. High school was brutal. The other kids sensed my vulnerability, and I endured their whispers, jabs, and isolation. Yet every insult, every night spent crying under the covers, only strengthened the resolve that I would rise above the circumstances forced upon me. I watched my peers' parents attend school events, buy cars, and pay for lavish birthdays, and I felt the sting of what I had lost, but I never allowed it to break me. I studied relentlessly, worked relentlessly, and dreamed relentlessly, fueled by a quiet promise to myself that one day I would never have to feel powerless again. College became my first taste of independence, a place where I could finally measure my own worth, not by the people who abandoned me, but by my own determination. I worked 2 jobs to pay for tuition, sometimes going without meals so I could cover rent, textbooks, and necessities. I made friends cautiously, always wary of letting anyone too close, afraid of abandonment. But I also discovered the power of genuine human connection through mentors and classmates who saw my drive and respected my resilience. After graduation, I landed a job at a small law firm where I learned to navigate complex legal systems, defend clients, and assert myself in ways I never imagined possible. Every long night at the office, every demanding case, every victory in the courtroom became a brick in the fortress I was building around my future. And then the accident happened. I was walking home late from work one rainy evening when a speeding car jumped the curb. The impact left me with a broken leg, a fractured arm, and months of recovery that tested every ounce of patience and endurance I had cultivated over the years. Insurance companies delayed, doctors argued about treatments, and the financial strain was almost as painful as the physical injuries, but I refused to give up. I hired a lawyer, fought every delay, and ultimately received a settlement that was not just life-changing, but life-affirming, a tangible reward for years of struggle, a proof that I could survive and thrive despite the absence of those who were supposed to protect me. That settlement was more than money. It was freedom, a key to a new chapter, a shield against the people who had tried to define me by their abandonment, and it was exactly what drew my parents back. Suddenly, the very people who had left me to suffer alone for 15 years appeared at my doorstep, their timing impeccable, their motives transparent. They spoke about inheritance, future plans, and family legacy, all while pretending to care about me as a person. I listened carefully, letting every word sink in, knowing that their return wasn't about love or reconciliation, but about entitlement and greed. I reflected on every moment of my past, every scar, physical, emotional, and mental, that they had left behind. I thought of the nights I cried alone, the meals I missed, the lessons I had to learn the hard way. I thought of my aunt who sacrificed so much to give me a life worth living, who became the real parent I needed. And as I sat there with my parents, their eyes flickering with false concern, I realized that the backstory of my life wasn't just a history of pain. It was a history of resilience, intelligence, and survival. And that history gave me the power to face them on my own terms. They had returned, but they were stepping into a world where I was no longer powerless, no longer a frightened teenager, no longer the victim of their selfish choices. The years of struggle, the sacrifices, and the victories had shaped me into someone capable of protecting herself, someone who could expose challenge and outmaneuver those who thought they could take what was never theirs. This was the foundation on which the coming confrontation would be built, a foundation of justice, strategy, and unwavering determination, a foundation that would ensure that while they might have returned, they would never control me again. The moment my parents appeared in my life again, the air felt heavy with pretense and unspoken accusations, like stepping into a play where I was no longer a silent extra, but the lead who could rewrite the script. I remember the first evening vividly. I had invited them over not because I wanted to see them, but because I wanted to gauge their intentions, to see the cracks in the facade they thought was flawless. My mother, Linda, with her perfectly styled hair and forced smile, began speaking about the family reunion they had supposedly missed over the years, while my father, Richard, leaned back in his chair with an air of entitlement, eyes flicking over the furniture as if calculating the value of everything I owned. Their words were coated in fake concern, and every sentence dripped with manipulation. They praised my success, complimented my apartment, and nodded knowingly at my career achievements, but the underlying message was clear. They were here to claim what they believed was theirs, and they expected me to comply without question. I stayed calm, letting them reveal their true selves, each sentence a breadcrumb trail of greed and guilt avoidance. I listened to their excuses for abandonment, financial struggles, personal issues, a desire for space, and my stomach twisted in anger at the audacity. 15 years of silence, pain, and neglect reduced to a few feeble explanations, like a mask over a monstrous truth. I had expected this confrontation to be uncomfortable, but I hadn't anticipated the sheer nerve it would take for them to speak of rights, inheritance, and family legacy as though leaving me to suffer was an act of preparation rather than cruelty. My heart raced, not with fear, but with anticipation. I knew I had the upper hand, armed with knowledge, legal protection, and the clarity that only years of hardship could provide. Over the following days, tension escalated as they lingered, inserting themselves into my life, sending messages that oscillated between feigned warmth and subtle threats. They contacted my colleagues, attempting to insert themselves into my professional life, hinting at connections they had never cultivated. They invited me to dinners, suggesting that family ties should override all else, and I attended with a polite, calculated demeanor. Every word measured, every smile controlled, every gesture, a silent assertion of dominance over the situation. Inside, I seethed, recalling nights of fear and longing when I had wished for their return, wishing they would appear to help, to love, to guide, and instead, realizing that what they sought now was leverage, a way to profit from the life I had painstakingly built. I began documenting every interaction, every email, every insinuation, knowing that my power lay not in confrontation alone, but in evidence and strategy. I contacted the lawyer who had helped me with my accident settlement, explaining the situation in precise detail. We mapped out potential scenarios, rights, and obligations, preparing for any move they might attempt. As the tension grew, I noticed small patterns in their behavior, the way my father avoided eye contact when discussing financial matters, the subtle smirk my mother would give when mentioning my Aunt Marlene, as if testing boundaries or sowing doubt. I realized that their strategy relied on intimidation, on guilt, on the implicit threat that I owed them something because of blood. And I understood then, with a clarity forged by years of neglect, that I owed them nothing. Nothing. I began planning not out of vengeance but out of necessity, ensuring that any action they took would be met with calculated legal and public consequences. I started gathering testimonies, financial records, and documented history of their abandonment. I reached out to friends and colleagues who had witnessed my parents' behavior over the years, preparing for the possibility that their greed would extend into public exposure, and knowing that exposure would be my ultimate shield. The rising tension was palpable. Every interaction felt like walking a tightrope over a chasm of betrayal. I could feel my pulse quicken when they hinted at lawsuits or potential claims, yet I remained poised, the calm eye at the center of a storm I had long anticipated. Each dinner, each casual visit, each message became a calculated maneuver, a way to observe, learn, and fortify my position. And then a subtle shift occurred. My parents began to grow impatient, frustrated by my refusal to comply, my insistence on transparency, my unwavering calm. They underestimated the years of struggle that had honed my intuition, my intellect, my ability to predict and respond to manipulation. Their arrogance became a weakness, their greed a glaring flaw, and I knew that the moment to act strategically was approaching. The tension had reached its peak. Every day was a chess match, and I had spent 15 years learning to see several moves ahead. They might have returned to my life expecting weakness, submission, and fear, but all they encountered was resolve, intelligence, and a meticulously constructed plan that would ensure they could never exploit me again. This was no longer a matter of past pain. It was a matter of justice, of reclaiming control, and of demonstrating in undeniable terms that family is defined not by blood, but by those who remain, who nurture and who honor the trust and love that I had fought so hard to preserve. The confrontation began one rainy evening, the kind of storm that mirrors internal chaos, when my parents, Linda and Richard, decided to push harder, believing that persistence and intimidation could break me. I had invited them to my apartment under the guise of civility, knowing full well that this was the pivotal moment, the juncture where patience meets exposure. The air was thick with tension, the room heavy with unspoken memories of pain and neglect. My father, Richard, leaned against the kitchen counter, attempting to dominate the space with his presence, while my mother perched on the edge of the couch, eyes darting, rehearsing lines that were meant to disarm and manipulate. They began with feigned concern, asking about my life, my health, my accident settlement. But each question carried a subtle threat, a reminder that they had rights they intended to exercise. I listened, nodding politely, my expression neutral, yet inside I felt the surge of anger that had been dormant for 15 years. I had rehearsed my words, my responses, my demeanor, knowing that any slip could give them leverage. Yet, I also knew that passivity was a weapon in itself. I asked them to clarify what exactly they sought, letting silence fill the space between sentences, forcing them to reveal their intentions, to expose the greed that had lain beneath their polished veneers for decades. My father's jaw tightened, my mother's hands fidgeted, and the cracks in their facade became glaringly obvious. They began to threaten subtle legal insinuations and comments meant to sow doubt, to make me question my ownership of my life and my settlement. But I remained calm, leaning slightly forward, voice, steady eyes, locked, conveying a silent message that I was no longer the scared child who had cried for attention and love that never came. I reminded them matter-of-factly of the past, the nights I had spent hungry alone and abandoned, the birthdays they had missed, the milestones they had ignored. Each word landed like a stone, breaking through the protective layers of their arrogance. They attempted to interrupt, to gaslight, claiming that everyone makes mistakes, that family bonds should outweigh past grievances, but I held firm, each statement a deliberate reminder that I owed them nothing, that their reappearance after 15 years of neglect did not grant them rights or forgiveness. The tension escalated as my mother grew defensive, raising her voice, her eyes glistening with faux remorse, while my father's posture stiffened, his hands clenching into fists, a testament to his frustration at my unshakable stance. I could see them calculating, realizing that the tactics that had worked on others, that had perhaps intimidated distant relatives, would not work on me. I had fortified myself with legal counsel evidence of their abandonment, and the unwavering certainty that my life was mine alone to control. I slowly laid out the facts, the accident settlement, the explicit terms, the guardianship and inheritance I had legally secured, and the documented history of their neglect. Each statement was punctuated with pauses, letting the weight of truth settle, letting them feel the undeniable reality that manipulation and intimidation could not override justice and law. My parents attempted one last maneuver, a plea for reconciliation, a mix of guilt, fear, and desire for inclusion, but I recognized it instantly as a tactic, and I countered with unwavering clarity. I explained that family was not merely defined by blood, that loyalty, sacrifice, and presence mattered far more than names on a birth certificate. I offered them a choice: acknowledge the past and leave without further interference, or face public exposure, legal consequences, and the undeniable truth of their selfishness, broadcasted for all who mattered to see. The room grew silent, the storm outside echoing the storm within. Their expressions shifted from arrogance to unease to fear as they realized that their schemes had been anticipated, countered, and nullified by strategy and intellect. I observed every micro-expression, every falter in speech, knowing that the confrontation had reached its apex. They attempted to negotiate, promising cooperation, feigning remorse, but I remained unyielding, asserting boundaries that had been ignored for too long. In that confrontation, I realized that power was not loud or aggressive. It was calm, deliberate, informed, and unwavering. I watched as the reality sank in. They were no longer in control, no longer the architects of fear, no longer entitled to what they sought. The confrontation ended with my parents leaving, not in anger, not in triumph, but in quiet, stunned acknowledgement that the child they had abandoned had grown into a force they could not manipulate or contain. I closed the door behind them, feeling a mixture of relief and triumph, a sense of justice that had been patiently crafted over years of hardship planning and resilience. It was a lesson not just for them, but for me, that confrontation, when wielded with intellect, strategy, and integrity, transforms fear into empowerment, and that the past, no matter how painful, can be confronted and turned into a foundation for strength. That evening, as I sat in the silence of my home, I felt the weight lift, the tension dissolve, and the clarity settle. Family is not always those who share your blood, but those who remain, who respect, who honor, and who stand by you unwavering and true. The revelation came not as a thunderous crash, but as a subtle, undeniable truth that had been simmering beneath the surface for years, a truth that would irrevocably change the trajectory of my life and the perception of those who had once wielded control over me. After the confrontation with my parents, I discovered through meticulous investigation and the quiet assistance of my legal counsel that their sudden reappearance was not driven by remorse or desire to reconcile, but by knowledge of my accident settlement and an attempt to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Every piece of correspondence, every veiled threat, every attempt at manipulation now fit together like pieces of a puzzle, forming a stark picture of greed, entitlement, and self-interest. The shock of this realization was profound, not because it was unexpected. Deep down, I had always suspected their intentions, but because it crystallized the reality that the people who were supposed to protect, nurture, and love me had never done so, and that even after years of absence, their primary concern remained self-serving gain. I remember sitting at my kitchen table late at night, documents sprawled before me, phone in hand, the rain outside mirroring the torrent of emotions within me. Anger surged, but it was tempered by clarity. Betrayal stung, but it was now harnessed as a catalyst for decisive action. I realized that the turning point in my life was not the settlement itself, nor the confrontation, but the recognition that the past, no matter how dark, could be leveraged to construct a future defined not by fear or dependency, but by autonomy, intelligence, and justice. This insight ignited a series of deliberate actions. First, I fortified my legal standing, ensuring that all aspects of the settlement were documented, enforceable, and impervious to manipulation. Then I began compiling evidence of their abandonment, their neglect, their failure to provide care, love, or guidance during formative years. Each memory I had once suppressed, the birthdays missed, the nights I cried alone, the milestones ignored, became ammunition transformed from personal pain into strategic leverage. It was in this meticulous assembly of facts that I felt a profound sense of empowerment, a reclamation of agency that had long been denied. As I delved deeper, I uncovered additional revelations. Distant relatives, once silent or complicit, were aware of my parents' patterns of behavior and had often intervened quietly to shield me from further harm. This network of discreet support, once invisible, became a foundation of strength, reinforcing the idea that family is defined not by blood, but by action, loyalty, and presence. With each revelation, my resolve solidified. The turning point was no longer a mere realization, but a call to action, a mandate to confront not only my parents' intentions, but the societal and familial expectations that had allowed them to believe their manipulation would succeed. I began crafting a plan that combined legal precision, public exposure, and personal integrity. The plan was intricate, balancing the need for justice with the ethical imperative to act without malice, to demonstrate that intelligence, patience, and steadfastness are more potent than vengeance alone. I anticipated their reactions, predicting the defensive postures, the gaslighting attempts, the feigned vulnerability, and prepared countermeasures that left no room for exploitation. This phase of revelation and turning point was not without emotional turbulence. Waves of grief, anger, and nostalgia ebbed and flowed, each surge reminding me of the child I once was and the adult I had become. Yet within this emotional undulation, I discovered resilience, a profound understanding that pain endured and analyzed could be transformed into wisdom, strategy, and empowerment. By the end of this period, I had not only mapped out a path to protect my assets and assert my autonomy, but also clarified the philosophical truth that would guide all subsequent actions. Those who abandon you cannot claim you, and those who remain, who sacrifice and stand by you, are the true family. This turning point, this revelation became the fulcrum upon which all future decisions would pivot, infusing each step with precision, each confrontation with purpose, and each interaction with clarity. In that quiet, storm-laden night, with documents organized and plans meticulously laid out, I understood fully that the power I now held was not derived from wealth alone, but from knowledge, strategy, and unshakable resolve. My parents' sudden presence, intended to intimidate and claim, had inadvertently catalyzed a transformation that I had long sought, a recognition of my own strength, the exposure of their duplicity, and the beginning of a chapter where justice, intelligence, and deliberate action reigned supreme. This moment marked the turning point where victimhood ended and agency began, where past trauma was repurposed as power, and where the blueprint for reclaiming life dignity and autonomy crystallized into action-ready clarity. With the revelations of my parents' true intentions seared into my consciousness, I knew that reaction without strategy would only play into their hands. Impulsive anger, open confrontation, or emotional outbursts would grant them the satisfaction of control, a privilege they had never deserved and would never earn. I began crafting a meticulous plan, an approach that would combine legal safeguards, psychological insight, and public exposure, all woven together to ensure that every step they took could be anticipated, countered, and neutralized. The first phase involved fortifying my legal position. I consulted with attorneys experienced in family law and inheritance disputes, presenting them with comprehensive documentation of my parents' abandonment, their neglect during my formative years, and their attempts to leverage my accident settlement for personal gain. Each record, each testimony, each piece of correspondence was meticulously cataloged, creating a shield that would prevent them from manipulating circumstances or claiming entitlement. Simultaneously, I began gathering evidence of their behaviors beyond legal documentation. Witness statements from neighbors, distant relatives, and friends who had observed their neglect, as well as personal journals I had maintained over the years, chronicling the pain, confusion, and moments of silent endurance that had shaped my life. Every detail was scrutinized not for the sake of reliving trauma, but to construct an unassailable narrative that would expose the truth to anyone who doubted it. Alongside the legal framework, I employed psychological strategy. Anticipating their reactions, I mapped out every possible attempt at manipulation. Guilt-tripping emotional blackmail, feigned vulnerability, or claims of moral superiority, and prepared measured fact-based responses designed to maintain composure and assert dominance without descending into vindictive behavior. This approach required immense discipline, as moments of personal resentment surged, tempting me to react emotionally. Yet I reminded myself continually that patience and intelligence were more powerful than immediate gratification. In parallel, I considered the public dimension aware that visibility could serve as both deterrent and safeguard. The people who had supported me, those who had stood silently alongside me during the years of abandonment, needed to understand the full story. Carefully, I began orchestrating scenarios that would expose the reality of my parents' neglect and selfishness without compromising my dignity or ethical standing. Social encounters, family gatherings, and controlled disclosures became stages where truth could be revealed gradually, allowing for a balance between justice and personal integrity. Every interaction was executed with precision, each word calculated to highlight accountability, to challenge assumptions, and to illuminate the contrast between my resilience and their opportunism. As I implemented these strategies, I noticed a shift. The power dynamic once heavily weighted in their favor, due to fear and history, began to tilt. My parents' attempts to assert dominance met with firm boundaries and factual rebuttals. Their confidence wavered and subtle panic became evident in their expressions and behaviors. This was not a triumph of cruelty, but a triumph of intelligence, patience, and foresight. It was a demonstration that deliberate action, informed by insight and fortified by preparation, could dismantle even the most entrenched patterns of control. Emotional turbulence persisted, of course, waves of frustration lingering, resentment, and flashes of past hurt. But they were now tools, reminders of the stakes and catalysts for precision rather than impulsivity. By the conclusion of this phase, I had transformed my past suffering into a strategic advantage. The years of abandonment, the years of silent endurance, and the years of isolation had honed my capacity for foresight, planning, and decisive action. I had created a blueprint not only for protecting my assets and asserting my autonomy, but for publicly demonstrating the consequences of toxic familial behavior. The strategic counteraction phase crystallized the lesson that strength is not merely reactive but proactive, that justice is not spontaneous but constructed, and that the culmination of awareness, preparation, and disciplined execution is more formidable than any emotional outburst or passive endurance. It was here, in the calculated orchestration of every legal, psychological, and public maneuver, that I truly grasped the power of intellect and resilience in reclaiming a life that had been undervalued and manipulated, setting the stage for the inevitable reckoning and public revelation that would leave no doubt of the truth. The day came when all the preparation, all the careful documentation, and all the strategic patience culminated in a moment of undeniable clarity and justice. I decided that the public dimension of my parents' return could no longer be postponed, that their attempts to insert themselves into my life and claim what they had no right to must be exposed in full view of those who had witnessed my journey and could recognize the stark contrast between their greed and my perseverance. I organized a gathering under the pretext of a family reunion, deliberately choosing a neutral venue that would accommodate friends, distant relatives, and professionals who had supported me through the years, ensuring that witnesses were present to validate every detail of my narrative. As my parents arrived, dressed in carefully selected attire that screamed feigned respectability, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and arrogance, I could feel the tension in the room, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of the confrontation to come. I opened the event with measured words, recounting my upbringing with honesty but restraint, painting a vivid picture of the neglect, abandonment, and emotional void that had defined my formative years. The room listened intently, the silence punctuated by occasional murmurs of disbelief as the truth unfolded. My parents attempted to interject, their voices laced with fabricated concern and rehearsed apologies, but I was prepared, having anticipated every tactic. With calm authority, I countered each claim, citing documented evidence, witness testimonies, and personal accounts that left no room for denial or reinterpretation. The shift in power was palpable. Onlookers who had once been passive observers now leaned forward, eyes wide with recognition, as the full scope of my parents' selfishness and manipulative behavior was laid bare. I invited my legal counsel to articulate the implications of their attempted claims, presenting contract settlement documentation and formal letters that explicitly nullified any entitlement they assumed they could leverage. The language was clear, the consequences undeniable, and the audience absorbed every word, nodding in silent agreement. As the confrontation progressed, I allowed space for emotional resonance, sharing not only the factual recounting, but also the personal impact, the fear, loneliness, and resilience that had carried me through decades of abandonment. This humanized the narrative, making it impossible for anyone to reduce my experience to mere legalities or monetary disputes. The reactions were immediate and varied. Some relatives expressed astonishment at the audacity of my parents' return. Others murmured admiration for my composure and strength, and a few who had previously doubted me now approached privately to offer support, validation, and solidarity. My parents' composure began to crack. Subtle gestures of frustration, fleeting attempts at intimidation, and strained smiles betrayed the fact that their carefully constructed facade was unraveling under the weight of truth. I deliberately maintained control of the narrative, choosing moments to pause to allow the room to absorb the impact and to reinforce the contrast between their opportunism and my integrity. Every detail was a calculated revelation. Emails they had sent demanding access, phone calls filled with veiled threats, and even casual conversations they had attempted to normalize, all presented as undeniable evidence of a pattern of behavior designed to exploit and manipulate. By the end of the gathering, the outcome was clear. My parents were publicly confronted, their attempts at reclamation rendered impotent, and the moral and social judgment of the assembled audience had decisively shifted in my favor. It was not vengeance that drove this moment, but truth visibility and the careful orchestration of justice that combined legal, emotional, and social dimensions. The lesson was unmistakable. Those who abandon and manipulate cannot reclaim power through audacity alone and integrity. Foresight and courage are more enduring and influential than any inherited blood tie. As I left the venue that evening, the sense of relief was profound, yet tempered by reflection. Justice had been served not through anger or retaliation, but through preparation, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to truth, setting a precedent for how boundaries, accountability, and personal sovereignty can be reclaimed even in the face of the most toxic familial betrayal. After the public exposure, there remained an intimate layer of confrontation that could not be addressed in the presence of an audience. I realized that to fully reclaim my narrative and assert the boundaries my parents had violated for decades, I needed a private confrontation that would strip away pretenses and force them to face the consequences of their actions without any spectators to distract or dilute the gravity of the encounter. I arranged a meeting at my home, a space that symbolized my autonomy and the life I had built through perseverance, hard work, and unwavering commitment to my own values. As my parents entered, their usual air of entitlement faltered slightly, replaced by the faint recognition that this environment did not bend to their whims, that the walls around me were not merely structural, but emblematic of my personal sovereignty. I began by recounting memories that had been shared between us, emphasizing not the bitterness, but the stark contrast between what a nurturing parent should provide and the cold reality of neglect I had endured. Their eyes shifted uncomfortably, their practiced deflections faltering as they realized the depth of the pain they had caused and the futility of their excuses. This was not about money, not about entitlement, but about facing the emotional truth that they had abandoned a child who had survived, thrived, and reclaimed her life despite their absence. As I spoke, I allowed my voice to carry both the calm precision of someone who had meticulously prepared and the raw honesty of someone who had carried decades of unacknowledged grief. The effect was immediate and disarming, as if each word acted like a mirror, reflecting their failures and their self-serving choices. They attempted to interject with rehearsed apologies and vague justifications, yet I did not allow interruptions, instead, responding with composed evidence, personal anecdotes, and pointed questions that exposed inconsistencies in their narrative, forcing them to confront the gap between their words and their deeds. The emotional intensity escalated not through shouting or aggression, but through the deliberate pacing of revelations, the quiet power of truth articulated without malice, yet impossible to ignore. Each moment was a reminder that abandonment and manipulation carry consequences that extend beyond the surface, touching the deepest layers of human experience and moral responsibility. I addressed the lingering impact of their absence on my life, from the formative years when I had to navigate fear, insecurity, and uncertainty alone, to adulthood where every achievement had been tempered by the shadow of knowing that those who should have supported me were conspicuously absent, leaving space for resilience, but also for enduring pain. My parents' expressions shifted from defensiveness to discomfort, and finally to a tentative acknowledgement of reality, their silence speaking volumes where words failed. In that silence, I recognized not reconciliation, but accountability, a crucial step that validated the effort, time, and strength I had invested in reclaiming my life. I concluded the confrontation by clearly stating my boundaries, asserting that while I had the capacity to forgive, I would not permit further attempts to exploit, manipulate, or insert themselves into my life without merit, and that any future interactions would be governed by respect, honesty, and legal clarity rather than fear, guilt, or coercion. As they left, the atmosphere shifted, leaving a sense of closure and empowerment. The confrontation had not been about vengeance, but about reclaiming emotional authority, establishing limits, and demonstrating that maturity, intelligence, and self respect can outlast any inherited sense of entitlement. Walking alone through the house afterwards, I reflected on the paradox of family, that blood ties do not guarantee loyalty, support, or care, and that the truest measure of family is the people who stay, who endure hardships alongside you, and who honor your life through presence, sacrifice, and unwavering support. The confrontation had been exhausting, emotionally draining, and at times overwhelming, yet it crystallized a profound truth. Strength lies not in retaliation or cruelty, but in clarity, preparation, and the courage to face those who have harmed you with both honesty and dignity. The experience left me both wary and enlightened, a reminder that life's most difficult lessons often come wrapped in the actions of those closest to us, and that the ultimate victory is not measured in material gain, but in the reclamation of peace, authority, and the integrity of one's own narrative. With the confrontation behind me, a sense of clarity settled in that I had never experienced before. The weight of decades spent reconciling my worth with the absence and failures of my parents began to lift, replaced by a deliberate focus on the life I had built, the relationships I had nurtured, and the accomplishments that were entirely my own. I began by reassessing my priorities, taking stock of the people who had stood by me through every challenge, from the friends who had become chosen family to the mentors and colleagues who had recognized my potential and supported my growth, proving that loyalty and love are earned through action, presence, and genuine care, rather than simply claimed through blood ties. I invested in myself more intentionally, expanding my professional ventures, dedicating time to personal development, and exploring passions that had long been postponed or diminished by the lingering shadow of abandonment. Each success was sweeter now, untainted by the need for validation from those who had once turned their backs. I also took deliberate steps to create a legacy that reflected my values, establishing charitable initiatives and mentoring programs that would ensure others facing neglect or adversity could find guidance, hope, and practical support, turning my painful history into a source of empowerment and opportunity for others. The lessons learned from my parents' absence informed every interaction I had, moving forward, teaching me discernment, patience, and the importance of boundaries. I realized that forgiveness was not about erasing the past, but about freeing myself from the emotional chains that had held me captive, allowing me to act from a place of strength and agency rather than resentment. As I nurtured my chosen family, the children, friends, and partners who had consistently offered love and support, I found that the most profound connections are built on mutual respect, shared experience, and unwavering presence, not on obligation or inherited ties, and that these bonds can heal wounds left by even the deepest betrayals. Professionally, I leveraged my achievements to reinforce my autonomy, using the accident settlement as a tool not for ostentation, but for strategic growth, ensuring that my financial independence created both security and the ability to make meaningful choices unconstrained by anyone else's interference. I also documented my experiences, sharing my story through carefully considered writing and speaking engagements, aiming to empower others who had endured similar familial betrayals. This act of storytelling became therapeutic, turning trauma into testimony and vulnerability into authority. In my private moments, I reflected on the paradox of survival that enduring abandonment and adversity can cultivate resilience, empathy, and insight that those sheltered from hardship may never fully comprehend. My journey underscored that life's trials, while painful, can be transformed into catalysts for profound personal and communal growth. I consciously celebrated milestones from professional achievements to personal joys, knowing that every accomplishment was a testament to my determination and to the people who had truly been family in the sense that mattered. Those who showed up sacrificed and remained steadfast when others had fled. Even in moments of solitude, I no longer felt the absence of my biological parents as an emptiness, but as a reminder of the self-reliance, courage, and intelligence that had carried me forward. The narrative had shifted from victimhood to empowerment, from longing for recognition to commanding respect through action, integrity, and wisdom. The final step in reclaiming my life involved establishing clear, enforceable boundaries regarding my parents' involvement, ensuring that any future contact would be governed by accountability, legal clarity, and respect, transforming a once toxic relationship into one that could exist only on my terms, if at all. Ultimately, this resolution brought peace not only in the sense of external circumstances, but within my own consciousness, affirming that family is defined not by shared DNA, but by the people who invest in your life, nurture your growth, and honor your journey, and that by reclaiming my story, I had reclaimed not only my present, but the promise of a future shaped entirely by my own choices and the love of those who had proven themselves worthy of the title of family. Looking back on the long, turbulent journey from the abandoned child I once was to the empowered adult I had become, I realized that every heartbreak, betrayal, and moment of fear had been a brutal but necessary teacher, forging in me a resilience that could never be taken away, no matter how callous or selfish others might be. The truth that crystallized through years of struggle was that family is not defined by the accident of birth, or by the hollow claims of people who refuse to honor their responsibilities, but by the consistent presence, sacrifice, and loyalty of those who choose to stand by you, even when life is messy, inconvenient, or painful. I reflected on how my parents' sudden reappearance, driven by greed and self-interest, had illuminated the stark contrast between those who use love as leverage and those who give love freely without expectation, and how this clarity allowed me to finally release any lingering desire for approval from them, replacing it with a profound appreciation for the genuine bonds I had cultivated over the years with friends, mentors, colleagues, and the surrogate family who had been my true support network. The lessons were harsh but empowering. The people who abandon you in your darkest moments are not entitled to your triumphs. And conversely, those who celebrate your successes without ulterior motive are the ones whose loyalty is real. Internalizing this principle reshaped how I approached relationships, enabling me to invest energy where it mattered, nurture connections that were mutually enriching, and let go of toxic attachments that had previously consumed my emotional bandwidth. I also considered the broader implications of my experience, recognizing that sharing my story was not merely cathartic, but necessary to illuminate patterns of familial dysfunction that often go unspoken, offering validation and guidance to others who may feel trapped in silence or burdened by guilt for wanting to protect themselves from abusive or neglectful relatives. In doing so, my journey became both personal liberation and social contribution, a testament that survival and intelligence can coexist with empathy and compassion. Legally, emotionally, and financially, I had reclaimed agency over my life, establishing firm boundaries and asserting my independence in ways that my younger self could never have imagined, demonstrating that courage, intellect, and patience are the most effective instruments for confronting betrayal and ensuring accountability. The victory was not in punishment alone, but in demonstrating that justice, when executed thoughtfully, is deeply empowering and transformative. Ultimately, the final reflection was clear and unambiguous. Love, loyalty, and respect are earned through presence, integrity, and shared commitment, not demanded by virtue of a shared last name, and that the most profound family is the one chosen consciously, nurtured intentionally, and protected fiercely. As I looked forward, I carried both gratitude and wisdom, understanding that life's adversities, while painful, are also crucibles for clarity and strength, revealing who is truly dependable and who is not, and that the measure of a person's life is not the obstacles they face, but how they respond, who they trust, and what legacy they build from the lessons learned. The journey had taught me that peace and fulfillment are not contingent on reconciliation with the unworthy, but on alignment with those who honor, uplift, and walk beside you through triumph and hardship alike, and that by consciously curating the circle of influence around me, I could ensure that my future would be guided by love, respect, and unwavering support rather than fear, obligation, or manipulation. In conclusion, I realized that the ultimate lesson, the one that crystallized every heartbreak, confrontation, and victory, was that family is defined not by blood convenience or entitlement, but by action, sacrifice, and fidelity. Those who abandon, manipulate, or exploit are not truly family, and those who stay, sacrifice, and uplift define what family is meant to be. And by embracing this truth, I had not only reclaimed my life, but had also defined my own legacy of integrity, resilience, and carefully chosen love, proving that in the end, the people who remain are far more important than those who walk away.